Welcome to Leaf Status Report for January 19th, 2026. As always, I've simulated the rest of the NHL regular season 11,000 times, with the Leafs performances across all simulations forming this distribution. As you all may recall from yesterday, we only had one key game happening last night. That was the Detroit Red Wings versus Ottawa Senators. Now, of course, I did mention we were hoping for the Detroit Red Wings to at least lose, hopefully in regulation, and unfortunately that didn't happen. The slight silver lining is that this game was a 4-3 Red Wings overtime win. So the Red Wings do obviously gain some gap on the Leafs, but it's certainly not as much as it could have been if this was a regulation win, especially by multiple goals. The other small silver lining is the fact that although the Detroit Red Wings do nudge themselves away from the Leafs by another 0.6-ish expected points today, the Sens do also lose a little bit of gap on the Leafs, going from a little under 5 expected points behind them to now a little over 5 expected points behind them. The Leafs lose 0.04 expected points over yesterday, going from 95.09 yesterday down to 95.05 today. The good news about today is that based on the theoretical value of expected points I've calculated for today's simulations, our simulations are almost bang on where they should be in theory. Yesterday we had, I believe it was a slight overestimation, so we did sort of have to keep that in mind while we're looking at the table. Today it's a pretty clean bang-on estimate, at least averaged overall simulations. Now, because the Leafs didn't play a game last night, we only have to worry about two controllable factors, plus randomness. Substituting all of yesterday's game data into today's simulations yields a net loss of 0.02 expected points. We have the same number of overtime games per simulation today as we did yesterday, so there's no change in expected points on that front, which overall means that randomness also slightly works against the Leafs today, with randomness favoring them by 0.02 expected points less today than it did yesterday. Across all simulations run today, the minimum number of points the Leafs scored in a season was 72, and the maximum number of points they scored in a season today was 115. That gives us an absolute range today of 43 points. Our inner 70% interval widens today from 11 to 12 points wide. Unfortunately, it widens from the bottom, not the top. Our 15th percentile Leaf season today was 89 points, and our 85th percentile Leaf season today was 101 points. Our standard deviation actually does go up today. I have a feeling it was just a bit abnormally low yesterday, perhaps. Yesterday, our standard deviation was 5.28 points, and today it's gone up to 5.35 points. Despite slipping in expected points a little over yesterday, the Leafs do gain 0.3% on their playoff odds. Yesterday, the Leafs made the playoffs in 52.6% of all simulations, and today they've managed to make the playoffs in 52.9% of all simulations. Our 95% confidence interval for these playoff odds sits the same as it has for the last little while. It's still at about plus or minus 0.93%. The Leafs Stanley Cup odds also increased a little over yesterday. Yesterday they won the Stanley Cup in 1.45% of simulations. Today they've managed to win it in 1.51% of simulations. With this, the Leafs' conditional odds of winning the Stanley Cup also increase, if only slightly. Today, out of all simulations where the Leafs make the playoffs, they win the Stanley Cup in 2.85% of them. Looking at the Leafs' placing distribution for today, unsurprisingly, I don't think there's a lot of notable changes compared to yesterday's distribution, considering we did only have one key game last night. There is one notable change I can think of mentioning off the top of my head, which is that our mode for this distribution has changed. Yesterday, the Leafs' most common placing was wildcard 1, and today their most common placing is wildcard 2. Do I think this is particularly bad news for us? If really all we care about at the moment is whether or not the Leafs make the playoffs, I don't really think so. A, our playoff odds did go up today, if only slightly, and B, it does more or less look like a lot of that wildcard 2, a lot of those extra wildcard 2 makes could have come from finishes where the Leafs would have fallen wildcard 3 yesterday, so that might end up working in our favor. Considering that wildcard 3 is, as I've mentioned many times, the worst possible finish we could have for the Leafs. The only major downside to extra wildcard 2 finishes is the fact that in wildcard 1, the Leafs probably run into the Carolina Hurricanes in the first round, and if they do end up finishing wildcard 2 instead, they are almost certainly going to be running into the Tampa Bay Lightning, or perhaps with a very strong back half of the season, the Detroit Red Wings, or maybe Montreal. Now, I don't want to disparage the Hurricanes, but I do think the Leafs stand a better chance against the Hurricanes than they would the Lightning, or even Montreal, based on what happened a couple of years ago. Looking at the table for today, of course, since there was only one key game last night, there's only at most 2 gaps to talk about. The Ottawa Senators gap doesn't really matter that much. It takes them from, last night's game takes them from a little less than 5 expected points behind to a little more than 5 expected points behind the Leafs, which doesn't really make them an imminent threat to us either way. As for the Detroit Red Wings, that side does matter. They gain 0.6 of an expected point, and it really does put a decently sized wrench in the Leafs' plans to try and get into an Atlantic Division spot in the next couple days. It's not an insurmountable gap. It is something the Leafs could probably make up in 1 or 2 games with the right performances, but it is going to make things slightly harder. Now, there are about 5 key games in the NHL today that might have some reasonable effect on the Leafs' playoff odds in tomorrow's projections. I'd split these pretty cleanly into 2 categories, which is just all the Metropolitan teams and all the Atlantic teams that we care about. For our Metropolitan teams, we have 2 games. At 5 p.m., the Seattle Kraken hosting the Pittsburgh Penguins, and at 10 p.m., the Vancouver Canucks hosting the New York Islanders. Now, the Islanders and Penguins, if they do win and pass the Leafs, won't knock them out of a projected playoff spot. They'll keep that wildcard 2 spot because both the Islanders and Pens currently hold divisional spots in the Metropolitan. However, if the Leafs are behind both of them tomorrow, then it means that the next Metropolitan team that does manage to pass them will take a playoff spot. So ideally, we'd like both of them to stay behind the Leafs, which for the Islanders, because their gap is almost non-existent on the Leafs, means we want them to almost certainly lose in regulation and lose that whole 1.2 expected points to widen that gap up a notable margin. And for the Pens, because they're a little further behind the Leafs, 1.31 expected points, I think we'd be fine with them matching or doing worse than the Leafs' points result in their respective game tonight. Now, we also have 2 Atlantic Division teams that aren't the Leafs that we care about tonight. At 1:30 p.m., the Carolina Hurricanes host the Buffalo Sabres, and at 6 p.m., the Florida Panthers host the San Jose Sharks. Now, the Buffalo Sabres currently have a little less than 1.6 expected points on the Leafs on our table. Given that they have an expected points yield for their respective game today of 1.05, I think it's fairly unlikely that the Leafs can reel them in unless they win. So I think reasonably we want the Buffalo Sabres to almost certainly lose in regulation and then see the Leafs win if our goal is to see the Leafs ahead of the Sabres tomorrow. As for the Panthers, they're a little over 2 expected points behind the Leafs right now. That is not a gap that's impossible to make up in one day, especially with the Leafs and Panthers both playing tonight. However, I do think that as long as Toronto can take their game to overtime, the Panthers don't have much of a shot of passing the Leafs in tomorrow's projections. The other upside here is that the Panthers have an expected points yield for their game of 1.36, which means that if they lose this game in regulation, it is a boon for us, and we probably won't have to worry about the Panthers catching the Leafs for the next couple days, unless the Leafs also lose horrifically, which I might have just jinxed. Now finally, at 7:30 p.m., the Leafs host the Wild. The Leafs are slightly favored to win this game, according to my own projections, with an expected points yield of 1.18. Like I have mentioned offhandedly, unless we have really good performances from all the other teams I've mentioned, I think we're fine with them losing this one in overtime to hold a playoff spot. However, of course, we would very much like them to win this. As for the Canadian teams, Montreal and Edmonton are fairly stable into the playoffs. Toronto's very iffy. Ottawa's dying slowly, and the Canadian teams win the Stanley Cup in 9.43% of all simulations.